Gotcha. And I have a question about the jihadis coming up, but before we get into that, now we're going to talk about the haircut. So I saw on your Instagram, and I think someone else might even have told me about it. I don't remember who, that you rocked a mohawk, a big mohawk in the invasion. So walk the viewers through why Chili Palmer had a mohawk. We'll flash it on the screen. What was the thinking with the mohawk on the invasion?
Well, we were watching Band of Brothers again before the invasion. We were out in Saudi and all that stuff in the tent, so everybody gathered around the laptops. Um, and I was like, you know what, this is an invasion. And if you look at what a lot of folks did prior to jumping in World War II for Normandy and everything else, they cut their hair into mohawks. Why? We had a lot of Native American folks represented in the military, and for them this was like going back to their heritage. And I just thought it was awesome because it's like, this is an invasion, let's do something. And so I just, the last day right before we were getting ready to leave, I had my buddy actually shave my head for me, and it actually worked out great because as we got dirtier and dirtier, because it was about I think 3 weeks before we got a sun shower even, it was actually easier to keep the center of my head clean, just a little bit of hair here instead of sitting there trying to keep a whole head of hair clean. So made it easier for hygiene.
Well, it's an awesome photo, and it is kind of neat, and it's a cool callback to the guys on D-Day. And as you've mentioned now a couple of times, Band of Brothers. For anyone watching this who has not seen Band of Brothers, you are missing out because it's probably the best war story, if you will, ever told, in my opinion, in the video format. And the book from Stephen Ambrose is also excellent. So you had just mentioned the jihadis, and I want to get into that because I think young people, kind of as we talked about a moment ago, who certainly weren't alive, maybe fail to understand what you're talking about when you're talking about jihadis and how they're different than maybe what people perceive as a standard enemy. So can you explain to the audience the difference between a loyalist to the regime and someone who is a violent jihadi terrorist?
Yeah, when you look at the loyalists to the regime, they had, their first thing was their country and everything else. Granted, they were, not the most, not their country was, Iraq wasn't run smooth. It was a dictatorship, everything else going on within there, but it was still about Iraq and everything else. So there was some loyalty just as a country, but with the folks coming in, the religious fundamentalists, they're out just to kill Christians, and because they hate, Christians. And it really stinks because of the fact that for them, it was like, well, the great jihad is now called basically go to war because, now it's like they've got to get rid of, the all us Christians and everybody else, just the folks in the Middle East that aren't supposed to be there in their mind. And so that was kind of their call to arms worldwide. And we ran into folks, all over that we've either captured or killed that were definitely not from Iraq. So it's, different. I mean, it's just a crazy thing, but it was really a call to arms. We hit a safe house one time in 03, October 31st, actually 03, when we were in Baghdad, and we went all the way out to our Ramadi, and the guys all had the same jogging pants, shoes, and everything. And what they had done is they come over there for the jihad, so they take their passports and they can't leave. So now they got control of them and they can't leave the country. So they kind of get them in on this whole thought, oh yeah, you're going to come in, you're going to do this, you're going to, and then all of a sudden they take them, and then they start, kind of like just keeping them to do what they need them to do and talking them into other things and so forth. And some of them, some of them are all about it. I don't know, it's just crazy.
When you would get into gunfights and engagements with those guys, I mean, were they competent fighters? Were they skilled in any way, or were they just kind of idiots who got their hands on an AK and had this sadistic mindset? I mean, were they able to put up a really good fight?
I think, you had some, like anything, that had some experience, and then some that were just coming over there wanting to get their jihad, and then they would get whatever training when they, either arrived in the country before they came directly into Iraq. So whatever the rat line was. But as we progressed down the road, they started having experienced fighters, and they started doing their lessons learned. So it became a more hardened fighter, especially with ISIS. I mean, they were a ruthless, ruggedized military in a way. So They definitely had some war hardened individuals.
Did you feel when you're fighting the jihadis, the people that are intent on killing, the Christian members of the Christian faith, people that they didn't feel belong there, did it feel more justified to you? Did it feel like it was more important maybe than fighting, again, the regime loyalists? Because, and I'm only speaking for myself here, when I see that level of barbaric behavior, and you're talking about Zarqawi chopping people's heads off and people drilling holes into other people's skulls, I see that as a guy who's just some bystander, and I say that's not even human behavior. That's
Right.
what rabid dogs do, and I would think I would much rather prefer to take them out, and it would feel better for me, again as an unbiased observer, than just the standing Iraqi army. Did you feel the same way, or was it equal to you?
Yeah, I think because things, transitioned from that regime side to that fundamentalist side. So we also had to change some of our tactics and our procedures and everything else and how we did things to cope with these guys because they were coming up with some ingenious ways of doing things along the line as well with some of the IEDs, some of the booby trapping the houses, things like that, using the cell phones to call to detonate everything. So it became, I think, as much as you say, more violent in that way because with the regime guys too, we knew that there was the end state was trying to get Saddam, so that we needed intel as well. We needed to gather that intelligence. There was only so much that was there from previous, just historical data. Then we had to actually make it real intel and workable intel. But with the fundamentalists, if you gave them a chance to vote, and we'd say vote based off, okay, does this guy want to is he going to go along with the capture or is he wanting to fight? And then let's see who wins. They would rather fight than do anything. There was, so many times guys would detonate suicide vests because it's like, well, they're not going to take me, clack themselves off, thinking they're killing, other folks around them. But they just, I don't know, they just were different folks, and it was like we had to get more violent in a way, because again, we were going after intel and doing things, and our procedures and everything on the battlefield just had to kind of adjust, just like they were doing.
That's crazy. I truly cannot imagine. And I was in college. I started college in what, 2010? So I was in high school when things were getting kind of real bad in the '06, '07 era. And I remember people would always talk about like, do we really need to be fighting these guys? Are they really that bad? And I'm like, this Zarqawi guy is literally chopping people's heads off, right? And don't think it stops there. Like if this guy could,
No.
he'd chop all of our heads off too. Fortunately, they dropped a couple bombs on him, I believe, if I recall correctly. So now I want to get into some comparing and contrasting. What were the big differences between fighting in Iraq versus fighting in Afghanistan? Was it mostly the terrain? Was it the level of the combatant? Like, what were the big takeaways that were different from each other?
I think early on with Afghanistan was, there's everything was so spread out. Everything was so far in between, and we didn't have many helo assets early in the war, just because of how, basically really having to share them along with the other task force and things like that. And so there was a lot more driving, or you would get flown to an area and then you'd be there for a bit, and then oh, you're not getting there, you're not getting back to your home base for a while. So you're trying to make do of it and literally just sometimes sitting around doing nothing. Um, but then within Iraq, you had more cities, bigger cities, everything else that we were hitting. I mean, granted, you had Kandahar, you had Kabul, but everything really wasn't happening in those locations. It was farther out because, where the terrorists had their training camps from, years before us ever getting there. But then within Iraq, they could hide right there in the cities. There were, so much just open roads, everything around, and everything else, at a lot more built up areas, and it was an easier road system to get around. So it made it easier for them as well to move around. The terrain, definitely changed throughout. Iraq, you had your river valleys in a way, and you had the humidity, you had palm groves, everything else, and then you had your rocky mountain areas, dry areas. But then Afghanistan was just so severe with the mountains. I mean, that that's some treacherous terrain in itself.